The Northwest Rebellion of 1885, the Second Riel Rebellion. The Northwest Rebellion, also known as the Second Riel Rebellion, was an armed rebellion of Metis under Louis Riel and an associated uprising of Cree and Assiniboine, mostly in the District of Saskatchewan, against the Canadian government. Important events included the Frog Lake incident and the capture of Batoche. The Northwest Rebellion began in March 1885, after Louis Riel returned from political exile in the U.S. With the assistance of Métis leader Gabriel Dumont, Riel declared a provisional government on March 18th, and rebel territory was carved out. As government forces responded, fighting broke out, with the last shooting over by the end of June. Rebel forces included roughly 250 Métis and 250 First Nations men, largely Cree and Assiniboine, who were led by Big Bear and Poundmaker and other First Nations chiefs. A non-Indigenous man, Honor Jackson, served as Riel's secretary. Defense of the Government of Canada depended on a force of 5,500 men, including Northwest Mounted Police, armed loyal residents of the Northwest Territories, and Canadian militia units, mostly from Ontario and Quebec, with a small force from Halifax, Nova Scotia. They were brought west by train. Riel's rebels seized many small settlements in what is now the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, including Fort Carleton, Fort Pitt, Battleford, and Frog Lake. Again, Fort Carleton, Fort Pitt, Cut Knife, Frog Lake. They won victories at Duck Lake and Fish Creek, but overwhelming government forces and a critical shortage of supplies wore down the rebels. Government forces finally quashed the rebellion by winning the Battle of Batoche. Cree and Assiniboine fighters suffered from the same supply shortages and, despite achieving limited victories at Cut Knife, Frenchman's Butte, and a major defeat at Loon Lake, surrendered in June and early July. Following the defeat of Indigenous forces, several chiefs were put on trial, found guilty, and served prison time. 8 Indigenous men were hanged in Canada's largest mass hanging for murders committed outside the military conflict. Following the end of the rebellion, Louis Riel was captured, put on trial, and convicted of treason. Despite pleas for clemency from many across Canada, he was hanged. Nomenclature. The conflict is referred to by several names, including the Northwest Rebellion, which is the most correct name, the Northwest Resistance, which makes no sense as the territory was legally part of Canada and was not in resistance of any occupying or invading force. The 1885 Resistance, which is once again false, the Northwest Uprising, the Saskatchewan Rebellion, which is incorrect since it also involved Alberta and had Manitoban, Ontarian, Quebecois, and Nova Scotian troops involved, and the Second Riel Rebellion. The conflict, grouped with the Red River Rebellion, or the First Riel Rebellion, is collectively referred to as the Riel Rebellions. The term rebellion and resistance are incorrectly used as synonymous. Rebellions are against the government of the country, and Saskatchewan and Alberta were clearly part of the Northwest Territories of Canada and had been since 1869. Resistance refers to conflict against an invader or occupier. The territories were part of Canada for about 25 years already, and clearly not invaded or occupied. Some academics correctly state the use of one term or the other changes the perspective of how the conflict is understood. Indigenous studies scholars and many academics incorrectly refer to indigenous uprisings in reaction to European colonization as resistances. Indigenous nations self-governed the land before the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, and then the Canadian government exerted sovereignty over it. This is totally false, as the indigenous groups and Metis were part of the HBC administration and had to be in order to supply the fur trade. Individual tribes had local governments, but all referred to the HBC for overall government. Canada was not a colony since July 1st, 1867. It was a dominion. Prime Minister Macdonald and the Canadian Parliament were independent of British Parliament, regardless of irrelevant terms within the British North America Act that made Canada subservient to Britain. From 1869, once again, the Northwest Territories, which included Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Northern Territories, were legally turned over to the Canadian government. The opinions of recent poorly supervised academics who were not corrected within the peer review system are irrelevant. Unfortunately, the use of the term resistance has spread to several organizations and publications, such as the Canadian Geographic, the Canadian Encyclopedia, and the Provincial Archives of Saskatchewan, showing the spread of biased narratives to mainstream and provincial government perspectives. Background. After the Red River Rebellion of 1869-1870, many Métis moved from Manitoba to the Fort Carleton region of the Northwest Territories, where they founded the South Branch settlements of Fish Creek, Batoche, St. Laurent, St. Louis, and Duck Lake, on or near the South Saskatchewan River. In 1882, surveyors began dividing the land in the newly formed District of Saskatchewan, according to the Dominion Land Survey's Square Township system. The established Métis farms were laid out in the seigneurial system. This meant narrow strips stretching up from a river. The Métis were familiar with this system from their French-Canadian culture. After the experience of the 1869 Red River Rebellion, surveyors were allowed to make exceptions to the standard survey practice to accommodate pre-existing river lot farms within 2 kilometers of a river. That was not understood by the people in the old-time communities. If they were more open to reason and explanation, this cause for rebellion would not have been built into the hysteria necessary to create conflict. Outside of the river lot groupings, the survey imposed a standard grid on the land, allocating particular numbered sections in each township to the HBC and the Canadian Pacific Railway, the CPR. There were no settlements yet in those areas, and the railway was not completed with its first line until 1883. So once again, this was not a reasonable cause for conflict. Railways were a necessary aspect of the advancement of nation building and the Industrial Revolution, linking the country from sea to sea anyway. There were still some problems, though. The 36 families of the St. Louis settlement found, after the Dominion Land Survey was done, that the Crown had sold their farms and the village site, which included a church and school, to the Prince Albert Colonization Company. Hugh McKay Sutherland was president of the Prince Albert Colonization Company. The families feared the loss of their homes and farms, which, now that the buffalo herds were gone, was their primary source of sustenance. The people should have pursued legal means from higher government officials to sort out the problem and remove and possibly discipline those responsible for the sale, which was in violation of the actual order not to change or alter pre-existing settlement arrangements. In 1884, the Metis in the South Branch settlements, including many Anglo-Metis, sent a delegation to ask Louis Riel to return from the United States, where he had fled after the Red River Rebellion, to appeal to the government on their behalf. He came and sent an appeal to the government. The government gave a vague response. The following year, on March 8, 1885, Riel and other prominent Métis at Batoche passed a 10-point revolutionary Bill of Rights that asserted Métis rights of possession to their farms, and demanded, among other things, that the government establish an office dealing with land issues in the Northwest. At this point, the demands were still reasonable. Then came the problem. On March 18, 1885, Riel, Gabriel Dumont, Honore Jackson, and others took the seminal step of setting up the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan, believing they could influence the federal government in the same way as they had in 1869. Riel wanted to be president of a new country again. This is clearly rebellion, not resistance. But much had changed since the Red River Rebellion. A railway had been completed across the prairies in 1883. Some sections were not yet completed north of Lake Superior in northern Ontario and in the Rockies. Even in its uncompleted state, the CPR eased the transit of government troops to Qu'Appelle. Qu'Appelle was more than 2,900 kilometers from Toronto and 260 kilometers in direct line from Batoche. The Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, created in 1873-74, served as an armed force as well. Its local detachments provided government presence at some trouble spots, at least potentially protected vulnerable settlements that had just been established, and also provided assistance and local knowledge to the Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia militia troops. As violence broke out, it became clear that English-speaking settlers on the prairies and the great majority of First Nations did not support Riel. Catholic officials saw as heresy Riel's claim that God had sent him back to Canada as a prophet, and they tried to minimize his support. Catholic priest Albert Lacombe worked to obtain assurances from Crowfoot that his Blackfoot warriors would not participate in a conflict. The First Nations were also frustrated at conditions at the time. By the end of the 1870s, the stage was set for discontent among the indigenous people of the prairies. Fur animals and bison were scarce, which caused enormous economic and food supply difficulties. In an attempt to assert control over indigenous populations, federal government officials sometimes held back rations, violating the terms of the treaties it had signed just prior to the conflict. First Nations' dissatisfaction with the treaties and rampant poverty spurred Cree Chief Big Bear to embark on a diplomatic campaign to renegotiate the terms of the treaties. The timing of this campaign coincided with widespread frustration among Metis, but it seems the Cree and Metis did not act in unison. This is an image of the chief of the Cree, Big Bear, at the time when he was trying to renegotiate the terms of the treaties. Some Cree took violent action in the spring of 1885, when the rebellion of Riel and the Metis was happening at the same time. But at least one researcher states that they were almost certainly unrelated. In both the Frog Lake Massacre and the looting of Battleford, small dissident groups of Cree men revolted against white authorities, ignoring the leadership of Big Bear and Poundmaker. Although he quietly signaled to Ottawa that these two incidents were the result of desperate and starving people and were, as such, unrelated to the ongoing Métis Rebellion, Edgar Dewdney, the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories, publicly claimed that the Cree and Métis had joined forces. Demographics. The District of Saskatchewan in 1885 included the central section of Saskatchewan and extended into present-day Alberta and Manitoba. The main area of conflict is circled in black. Other points where actions took place are marked. The 1885 census of Assiniboine, Saskatchewan, and Alberta reported a total population of 48,362. Of this, 20,170 people, about 40%, were status Indians. The District of Saskatchewan, part of the Northwest Territories in 1885, was divided into 3 sub-districts and had a population of 10,595. To the east, the Carrot River sub-district, with 1,770 people, remained quiet. The Prince Albert sub-district, in the center of the district, had a population of 5,373, which included the South Branch settlements with about 1,300. The South Branch settlement was the center of Louis Riel's provisional government of Saskatchewan during the conflict. To the west, the Battleford subdistrict, where the Cree uprising of people in bands led by Poundmaker and Big Bear occurred, had 3,603 people. The largest settlement and the capital of the district was Prince Albert, with about 800 people, followed by Battleford, with about 500 people, who were divided equally between French, Métis, and English. The Métis population in Saskatchewan in 1885 was about 5,400. A majority tried to stay neutral in the dispute with the national government, as the priests recommended. About 350 armed men supported Riel. A smaller number opposed him, led by Charles Nolan. In addition, he had the support of a small number of members of First Nations. Riel supporters included the older, less assimilated Metis, often with close associations with the First Nations population. Many moved back and forth into First Nations communities and preferred to speak Indigenous languages more than French. Riel's opponents were younger, better educated Métis. They wanted to be more integrated into Canadian society, not to set up a separate domain, as Riel promised. Course and suppression. On March 18, 1885, Riel, Gabriel Dumont, Honor Jackson, and others set up the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan. Riel had been invited in to lead the movement, but he turned it into a military action with a heavily religious tone, thereby alienating the Catholic clergy, the whites, nearly all of the First Nations, and most of the Métis. He had a force of a couple hundred Métis and a smaller number of First Nations at Batoche. In May, confronting isolated groups of armed settlers, HBC trading posts, and NWMP detachments, and 2 small militia units at Winnipeg. Reports of the provisional government were discredited at Ottawa and at first thought to be a device of the Liberal Party. But on March 23rd, Prime Minister MacDonald publicly confirmed the news of the rebellion. Immediately, the federal government sent Major General Frederick Middleton, the commander of the Canadian militia, to Winnipeg, where a militia unit, the 90th Winnipeg Rifles, and a militia artillery unit, the Winnipeg Field Battery, already existed. Eventually, over a period of many weeks, Middleton brought 3,000 troops to the west and incorporated another 2,000, mostly English-Canadian volunteers, and 500 Northwest Mounted Police into his force. They were formed into 3 columns that independently marched north from the line of the CPR. This led to the Battle of Duck Lake. The Battle of Duck Lake was an infantry skirmish on March 26, 1885, between Northwest Mounted Police forces of the Government of Canada and the Métis militia under Louis Riel's newly established Provisional Government of Saskatchewan. The skirmish took place 2.5 kilometers outside Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, and lasted approximately 30 minutes, after which Superintendent Leif Newry Fitzroy Crozier of the NWMP, his forces having endured fierce fire, with 12 killed and 11 wounded, called for a general retreat. Although Louis Riel proved to be victorious at Duck Lake, the general agreement among historians is that the battle was strategically a disappointment to his cause. Prelude. On March 19, 1885, Louis Riel self-affirmed the existence of the new Provisional Government of Saskatchewan. Following Riel's declaration, the Canadian government sought to reassert their control over the turbulent territory. Leif Crozier, the newly appointed NWMP superintendent and commander of northwestern Saskatchewan's forces, requested immediate reinforcement to Fort Carleton because he feared the growing instability created by Riel and the ever-growing possibility of a First Nations uprising. Riel dispatched emissaries to deliver an ultimatum calling for the surrender of Fort Carleton without bloodshed. Crozier's representatives rejected the demand and vowed that the Métis leaders would be brought to justice. On March 25th, in need of supplies for his men and horses, Crozier ordered Sergeant Alfred Stewart, Thomas Mackay, and 17 constables to Hilliard Mitchell's General Goods Store at Duck Lake. Unbeknownst to Crozier, however, Commander Gabriel Dumont, who was Riel's right-hand man, and his Métis force had already entrenched themselves on the road to Duck Lake. On the morning of the 26th, Stewart's party encountered the band of Métis near Duck Lake. After ample harassment, Stewart decided not to risk a physical engagement and chose to return to Fort Carleton. No shooting occurred yet at this stage of the battle. Crozier rallied together a larger force, which included 53 NWMP non-commissioned officers and men, 41 men of the Prince Albert Volunteers, which is now part of the North Saskatchewan Regiment, and a 7-pounder cannon, and set out to secure the much-needed supplies and to reassert the authority of the Canadian government in the District of Saskatchewan. Battle. The forces met about 2.5 kilometers outside Duck Lake on a snowy plateau covered by trees, shrubs, and a few log cabins. Having spotted Crozier's force, Gabriel Dumont ordered his men to set up defensive positions around the log cabins and lie in wait. Similarly, Crozier's scouts informed the superintendent of the movements of the Métis. Then, Crozier ordered his men to halt and deploy their sleighs parallel to the road, which was just before them. Both sides took up defensive positions. Gabriel Dumont dispatched his brother Isidore and an elderly half-blind chief Assiniboine with a white flag in hopes of distracting Crozier's forces. The superintendent, believing that Dumont was interested in a parley, walked forward with an English interpreter, Gentleman Joe Mackay. During the half-hearted discussion, Crozier came to believe that Isidore and Assiniboine were stalling so that the Métis force could maneuver to flank his own men. As they began to leave, both Assiniboine and Isidore attempted to draw their guns, prompting Crozier to give Mackay the order to fire. A brief scuffle ensued between the two parties, which resulted in Mackay shooting and killing both Isidore and Assiniboine. Despite the firepower and training of Crozier's militia, the Métis force was more numerous, and their position within the log cabins and the tree line proved to be an efficient advantage. In an attempt to relieve the pressure on the Prince Albert Volunteers, Crozier ordered the 7-pounder to target the log cabins. After numerous discharges, a shell was placed in before the powder charge was inserted, which disabled the cannon for the remainder of the battle. Within half an hour, Crozier recognized the unavoidable and sounded a general retreat back to Fort Carleton. The Métis were eager to chase down Crozier and his retreating force, but Louis Riel intervened and declared the battle over. Aftermath. The battle toll was high for the government forces. 12 men were killed and 11 men seriously injured. For the opposing side, 5 Métis warriors were killed in the skirmish, including Dumont's brother. Furthermore, Gabriel Dumont himself was injured in the head by a passing bullet. Losing to Riel and the Metis force came as a great shock to Crozier's supervisors. Colonel Atchison Irvine, Crozier's supervisor, suggested that Crozier's officerial prowess and judgment was overruled by impulsiveness. Fort Carleton, a trading post with few defensive installations, was now in serious risk of attack. Immediately, Colonel Irvine summoned a council to discuss the future of Fort Carleton. The resounding unanimous decision was in favor of the evacuation and destruction of the fort. By 4 a.m. on March 28th, the last sleigh had left the smoldering fort. In the span of 3 days, and with the loss of only 5 men, Riel's forces had defeated Crozier's militia, forced the destruction and scavenged the remains of Fort Carleton, and spread fear of Metis uprising throughout the Northwest Territories. Riel's plans were not completely successful, though. He had hoped to capture Crozier and his men as hostages so that he might force the government's hand. Thus, while tactically successful, the Battle of Duck Lake proved to be a strategic disappointment for Riel. Here is an image of the March 26, 1885 Battle of Duck Lake between the Canadian militia and the Northwest Mounted Police versus the Metis and Aboriginal warriors. Legacy. The National Historic Sites and Monuments Board made a plaque for the battle site that reads as follows: Duck Lake Battlefield. Here, on 26 March 1885, occurred the first combat between the Canadian government forces under Major L.N.F. Crozier and the Metis and Indians under Gabriel Dumont. Ici, le 26 mars 1885 est lieu la première rencontre entre les troupes du gouvernement du Canada, commandées par le major Crozier, et les Métis et Indiens, commandés par Gabriel Dumont. The site of the battle was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1924. In the spring of 2008, Tourism, Parks, Culture and Sport Minister Christine Tell said in Duck Lake that the 125th commemoration 2010 of the 1885 Northwest Resistance Rebellion is an excellent opportunity to tell the story of the Prairie Métis and First Nations peoples' struggle with government forces and how it shaped Canada today. No, it didn't. Duck Lake is home to the Duck Lake Historical Museum and the Duck Lake Regional Interpretive Center, and murals which reflect the history of the rebellion in the area. The Battle of Duck Lake and Buffalo Jump are located here. A buffalo jump, or sometimes bison jump, is a cliff formation that indigenous peoples of America, beginning with the Clovis culture, 11,100 BC to 10,800 BC, historically used to hunt and kill plains bison in mass quantities. The broader term game jump refers to a man-made jump or cliff used for hunting other game, such as reindeer. The first shots cairn was erected on Saskatchewan Highway 212 as the landmark commemorating the scene of the first shots in the Battle of Duck Lake. This is what the cairn reads. Duck Lake Battlefield. Here, on March 26, 1885, occurred the first combat between the Canadian government forces under Major L.N.F. Crozier and the Métis and Indians under Gabriel Dumont. Below is the same thing in French. The next plaque is in a chapel in St. Albert, commemorating the government soldiers and police killed at Duck Lake. The Our Lady of Lourdes Shrine in St. Laurent, north of Duck Lake, is a local pilgrimage site. On March 30th, a group of armed Cree, short of food due to declining bison populations, approached Battleford. The inhabitants fled to the nearby Northwest Mounted Police Post at Fort Battleford. The Cree then took food and supplies from the abandoned stores and houses.
We are now at Fort Battleford, Saskatchewan, National Historic Site of Canada. Fort Battleford. Here in July 1876, Superintendent James Walker established a post of the Northwest Mounted Police in the heart of the Cree country. The fort grew to a strength of 200. During the uprising of 1885, it gave refuge to more than 400 people and was the base for operations at Cut Knife Hill and Fort Pitt, leading to the surrender of Chief Poundmaker and the search for Big Bear. With the extension of settlement and mechanization of the force, it ceased to be the barracks in 1924. Fort Battleford here on this side. Fort Battleford. In 1885, violence erupted at Frog Lake and Fort Pitt. Frog Lake and Fort Pitt. Fearing for their own safety, over 500 local people sought refuge within the walls of Fort Battleford. Here. Frog Lake and Fort Pitt are up here on the top. People ran to get refuge at Fort Battleford. Upon the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Otter's troops, Fort Battleford became the base for military operations. Otter led an attack on the Poundmaker Reserve at Cut Knife Hill and was forced to retreat by the Cree. At the conclusion of the conflict, the NWMP were tasked with locating and arresting Chief Big Bear. Chief Poundmaker arrived on May 26 and was arrested for treason felony. 8 First Nations men were tried for murder, resulting in Canada's largest mass hanging on November 27, 1885. Fort Battleford, Battleford, North Battleford, Frog Lake, Fort Pitt, Frenchman Buck, Butte, Steel Narrows, Lloydminster, Rosetown, Fort Walsh, Cypress Hills is down that way, Saskatoon, Fort Carleton, Duck Lake, Batoche, Torrance Coulee, Fish Creek.
Here is a better look at the map.
The looting of Battleford. Again, here we are at Fort Battleford. The looting of Battleford began at the end of March 1885 during the Northwest Rebellion in the town of Battleford, Saskatchewan, then part of the Northwest Territories. Within days of the Métis victory at the Battle of Duck Lake on March 26, 1885, Cree bands sympathetic to the Métis cause and with grievances of their own, raiding stores and farms in the western part of the District of Saskatchewan for arms, ammunition, and food supplies, while civilians fled to the larger settlements and ports of the Northwest Territories. Prominent leaders of this uprising were Chief Poundmaker and Chief Big Bear. Poundmaker and his band had a reserve near present-day Cut Knife, about 50 kilometers or 21 miles west of Fort Battleford. Big Bear and his band had settled near Frog Lake, about 55 kilometers, 34 miles northwest of Fort Pitt, but had not yet selected a reserve site. Both bands were signatories of Treaty 6 and were unhappy in the way it was implemented by the Canadian government. The loss of the buffalo and the inadequate rations provided by the Indian agents kept the bands in a continual state of near starvation. Geography. The District of Saskatchewan in 1885 was divided into 3 sub-districts and had a population of 10,595. To the east, the Kellet River sub-district with 1,770 people remained quiet. The Prince Albert sub-district, located in the center of the district, had a population of 5,373, which included the South Branch settlements with about 1,300. The South Branch settlements was the center of Louis Riel during the rebellion. To the west were the Cree uprising led by Poundmaker and was the Battleford sub-district with 3,603 people. The largest settlement and the capital of the district was Prince Albert with about 800 people, followed by Battleford with about 500 people, divided about equally between French, Métis, and English. Battleford is located on the Battle River, near the North Saskatchewan River, here. On the south side of the Battle River was Old Town, and the north side, nearest the North Saskatchewan River, was the New Town and Fort Battleford, this side of the river. The city of North Battleford was founded in 1905 when the construction of the Canadian Northern Railway main line to Edmonton placed the line on the north side of the North Saskatchewan River. Here is a map of the area for the siege of Battleford. Okay. On March 28, as news that several Indian bands, including Poundmakers, were on their way to Battleford, settlers began moving into the nearby Northwest Mounted Police Post, here, Fort Battleford, which was under the command of Colonel Morris and 25 police. Over the next several days, 500 civilians would take refuge within the palisades. Many crossed over an unstable ice bridge out there on the Battle River, leaving most of their possessions behind in the old town, there in the distance. During the night of March 29th, nearby homesteads were raided, their horses and cattle rounded up by the bands. Also on the trail to join Poundmaker in Battleford were the Assiniboine from the Eagle Hills, approximately 30 kilometers south of Battleford. On March 29th, they killed their farm instructor, John Payne, raided homesteads, and killed a farmer by the name of Fremont, also known as Crooked, was later found guilty of Payne's murder, and Rehan Mitch, Man Without Blood, for Tremont's murder. Both were hanged. On March 30th, Poundmaker asked for a meeting with the Indian agent, J.M. Ray. After Ray refused to meet with him, the combined Battleford bands took food and supplies from the abandoned stores and warehouses. The next day, the bands camped a few miles away, bringing with them their looted provisions, including cattle and horses, that eventually returned to Poundmaker's reserve. The new town was protected by its proximity to the fort and its cannon. So over here, that cannon gave cover to the new town on this side of the river. But the old town, about a mile away, was not. That's that on the other side of the river. Every day until the arrival of Colonel Otter's column on April 24th, the occupants of the fort watched futilely as Cree looters raided the old town over there. Stolen vehicles and horses carried away the supplies of the Hudson's Bay Company and the other merchants. The looters sacked all the public buildings, including the Battleford Industrial School, located in the old government house. Most homes, including the imposing home of Judge Charles Rouleau, caught on fire. Just half a dozen were left standing. Aftermath. Summoned by the police at Battleford, Colonel Otter's column of the government troops arrived at Battleford, eliminating the threat. Not staying in town, on May 2nd, Otter's column attacked Poundmaker's camp at Cut Knife Creek, but was forced to retreat from the battle. Poundmaker prevented his fighters from attacking the retreating troops. We'll now move on to Cut Knife.
Historiographical interpretation. The nature of the Cree advance on Battleford, like the entire 1885 rebellion, is a source of historiographical controversy. Historiography is the study of the methods used by historians in developing history as an academic discipline. By extension, the term historiography is any body of historical work on a particular subject. The historiography of a specific topic covers how historians have studied that topic by using particular sources, techniques of research, and theoretical approaches to the interpretation of documentary sources. Historian Douglas Hill characterized the Cree group as a war party, ready to take revenge for a winter of incalculable suffering, who swooped on Battleford, killing 6 whites. George F.G. Stanley's writing on the subject indicated that the Cree were not murderous, but more haphazard and bumbling. He wrote that they did not appear to have in mind an attack upon the town, but were content with prowling around the neighborhood. This makes no sense, since the only reason that the new town wasn't attacked was that it was within range of the cannons of the fort. John L. Tobias said that the Cree tried to demonstrate their peaceful intent by including women and children in their groups, and simply took food to sustain themselves after finding the town abandoned, and then withdrew to avoid conflict with the police. This is absurd, as Native peoples often brought women and children on major raids throughout the history of warfare in North America, as they could improve the process of looting as well as handle possible prisoners. The old town and outer settlements had to be abandoned due to the murders of 6 settlers and the threat of further violence. Government mobilization. After the declaration of a provisional government, lawlessness in the Batoche area, and the battle at Duck Lake, the government immediately commenced the mobilization of some of Canada's ill-equipped part-time militia units, the non-permanent active militia, as well as the units of cavalry, artillery, and infantry regulars that made up the tiny permanent active militia, which were Canada's almost non-existent regular army. By March 30th, after hasty mobilization in Toronto, 2 trains containing the 10th Royal Grenadiers, which are now perpetuated by the Royal Regiment of Canada in Toronto, and Queen's Own Rifles militia battalions were ready to leave Toronto. Other militia units, the 9th Voltigeurs from Quebec City and the 65th Mount Royal Rifles from Montreal were also quickly mobilized. Soon, every major city in the east, such as Halifax, was the scene of embarkation for inexperienced young militiamen, cheered by immense crowds. Many of the soldiers suffered from the winter during the transit to the trouble spot. The militia, struggling westward, had to contend with many breaks in the CPR line in northern Ontario. They marched through snow or were carried in exposed sleighs. They rode in rustic railway flat cars over the completed stretches of track, which did not shelter them from the cold. During the campaign, the troops dealt with snow, muskeg, and black mud. Here is an image of the Canadian militia on the march towards the conflict, near the Qu'Appelle Valley. Enlistment and popular engagement in the suppression of the rebellion rose after several non-combatants were killed at Frog Lake. On April 2nd, at Frog Lake, District of Saskatchewan, which is now in Alberta, a Cree raiding party led by Cree War Chief Wandering Spirit attacked local officials in the small settlement. Wandering Spirit's men were angered by what seemed to be unfair treaties and the withholding of vital provisions by the Canadian government. This was, once again, due to corrupt Indian agents from their own tribes. They were also made desperate by the dwindling buffalo population, which was their main source of food. On the morning of April 2nd, 1885, Plains Cree warriors in Frog Lake, Northwest Territories, approximately 25 miles northwest of Onion Lake, decided to take matters into their own hands and killed 9 white men in a tragic event that has become infamously known as the Frog Lake Massacre. 2 of the men killed were farm instructor John Delaney and Indian agent Thomas Quinn. The Frog Lake Massacre. The Frog Lake Massacre was part of the Cree uprising during the Northwest Rebellion in Western Canada. Led by Wandering Spirit, Cree men attacked and killed 9 officials, clergy, and settlers in the small settlement of Frog Lake, at the time in the District of Saskatchewan, in the Northwest Territories on April 2nd, 1885. The location is about 200 kilometers east of Edmonton and is now within the province of Alberta. Causes. Chief Big Bear and his band had settled near Frog Lake in late 1884. He had signed Treaty 6 in 1882 and been pushed to move his band to be near Fort Pitt, located about 55 kilometers from Frog Lake, but had not yet selected a reserve site. Angered by what he saw as an unfair treaty and by the dwindling buffalo population and the subsequent enforced starvation of the Cree people, Big Bear began organizing the Cree for resistance, or more correctly, rebellion. He signed the treaty, therefore recognized that he and his people were subject to the Canadian government. This was rebellion. On March 28th, the Indigenous people living at Frog Lake learned of the Metis victory at the Battle of Duck Lake 2 days before, and of pound makers looting at Battleford. Hearing a rumor that a war had started and Canadian soldiers were coming to Frog Lake to kill Indigenous people there, This was pure hysteria, as they were obviously not coming to do that. Wandering Spirit took on the post of war chief of Big Bear's band. He began a campaign to gather arms, ammunition, and food supplies in preparation for establishing a defended camp. The largest local source of supplies were the government stables, the Hudson's Bay Company post, and George Dill's general store at Frog Lake. Indian agent Thomas Quinn, as an official of the Canadian government, was seen to be protecting the supplies, which was exactly what he was supposed to do, and therefore an obstacle to Wandering Spirit's aims. Meanwhile, Cree in the area were angry at Quinn because he had control of the inadequate rations that kept the Cree in a state of near starvation. Apparently, they wanted more free food and didn't think to request more supplies through official means or to try to farm or raise livestock more. But the attacks that occurred were perpetuated by several members of Big Bear's band, which had moved into the area not long before, not the local Cree. Massacre. A group of armed Cree, led by the war chief Wandering Spirit, took Thomas Quinn hostage in his home in the early morning of April 2nd. The Cree then took control of the community, looting various stores and eating food. Many of the white settlers in the settlement attended the local Catholic church, where two priests concluded at around 11 a.m. Wandering Spirit ordered the whites to move to a native encampment a couple of kilometers away. Quinn repeatedly said he would not be moved. In response, Wandering Spirit shot him in the head. After that, despite Big Bear's attempt to stop the shootings, Wandering Spirit's group then killed another 8 unarmed people. These were the 2 Catholic priests named Leon Fafard and Felix Marchand, and the others were Fafard's lay assistant John Williscroft, as well as John Gowanlock, John Delaney, William Gilchrist, George Dill, and Charles Goen. A Hudson's Bay Company clerk, William Bleasdale Cameron, who had been made to go to the church, after Mass had gone to the Hudson's Bay shop to fill an order made by Quinn for Miserable Man. When the first shots were fired, he escaped with the help of sympathetic Cree and made his way to a nearby Woods Cree camp, where the chief protected him. After the 9 people were killed, Wandering Spirit's men took captive the surviving white and government loyalists in the community. The hostages numbered about 70 and included Teresa Gowanlock and Teresa Delaney, wives of 2 of the slain men, and their children, as well as William Cameron and several Métis men. These were John Pritchard, Pierre Blondin, Dolphus Nolin, and Louis Goulet, and others. Pritchard and another Métis man ransomed the 2 widows for 2 horses each and put them under Pritchard's protection, to which they possibly owed their lives. The 2 Teresas later wrote a book on their experience, which was 2 months in the camp of Big Bear. William Cameron's book, Blood Red the Sun, also gives an account of the killings and their aftermath. Here is an image of survivor William Bleasdale Cameron with Horsechild. He was the 12-year-old son of Big Bear. They were photographed together in Regina in 1885 during the trial of Big Bear. Cameron testified in Big Bear's defense. Henry Ross Halpin, a long-serving HPC official, was at Frog Lake that day. He became one of the hostages and was held for 6 weeks, during part of which he acted as Big Bear's secretary. He later also spoke in defense of Big Bear. Aftermath. After the massacre, several of the Metis residents, who were now captive, hurriedly placed the bodies of Fafard, Marchand, Delaney, and Gowanlock in the cellar under the church. At great risk, they also moved the bodies of Quinn and Goen into the cellar of a house near where they were killed. However, they were refused permission to touch the other victims. 2 days after the killings, the church, the rectory, and all the buildings of Frog Lake settlement were burned on April 4th, 1885, which was the day before Easter. All that remained of the mission was the bell tower and the cemetery. The Frog Lake incident, along with the Metis Rebellion at the same time, prompted the Canadian government to send troops and police to the area. This is Thomas Bland Strange, who commanded the group, who commanded the force. The Midland Provisional Battalion, also known as the Midland Battalion, was a military unit of the non-permanent active militia of the Canadian Militia, now the Canadian Army, from Eastern Ontario, Canada, which fought in the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. Placed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel A.T.H. Williams of the 46th East Durham Battalion, the battalion consisted of about 370 officers and men by grouping together 8 companies from 7 different Canadian militia infantry battalions from Eastern Ontario, and served during the conflict in General Middleton's column of the Northwest Field Force. The battalion most notably served at the Battle of Batoche, where, fighting alongside the 10th Royal Grenadiers and with support from the 90th Winnipeg Rifles, the battalion charged and captured the Metis rifle pits. After the end of the rebellion, the battalion was disbanded in the same year. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles are now, the 90th Winnipeg Rifles in 1885 are now the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. The 46th East Durham Battalion in 1885, the main unit at the time, became the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment. The 10th Royal Grenadiers in 1885 became the Royal Regiment of Canada. On June 14th, the Midland Battalion, which was the advance guard of Major General Thomas Bland Strange's Alberta Field Force, arrived and buried the victims of the massacre in the cemetery. During their occupation, the bell hanging in the fire-blackened bell tower was taken. This bell was later displayed prominently in the Legion Hall at Midland, Ontario, and was confused with the Bell of Batoche. It was taken from there in 1991 and was found in Métis hands in 2013. The Alberta Field Force then pursued Big Bear's band, accompanied by its hostages, fighting them at Frenchman's Butte. The Battle of Frenchman's Butte will be discussed later in this video. When the rebellion was put down and law and order restored, Wandering Spirit, the war chief responsible for the Frog Lake incident, walked to Fort Pitt, where he turned himself in. Wandering Spirit, whose real name was Kapapa Machakwu, a Plains Cree war chief, Little Bear, also named Apaschiskus, Walking the Sky, also known as Round the Sky, Bad Arrow, Miserable Man, Iron Body, Crooked Leg, and Man Without Blood were put on trial for murders committed during the Frog Lake Massacre and at Battleford, for the murders of farm instructor Payne and Battleford farmer Barney Tremont. None of the accused were allowed legal counsel, and Judge Charles Rouleau sentenced each of them to death by hanging. He sentenced 3 others to hang as well, but their death sentences were commuted. Sentenced to be hanged, and perhaps in an attempt to expiate his offenses, Wandering Spirit attempted suicide, but lived to be hanged. Wandering Spirit and the 7 others were hanged on November 27, 1885, in the largest mass hanging in Canada's history. This is the headstone of the mass grave of the Cree murderers. They are listed as Wandering Spirit, Round the Sky, Bad Arrow, Miserable Man, Iron Body, Little Bear, Crooked Leg, and Man Without Blood. Although Big Bear had opposed the attack, he was charged with treason because of his efforts to organize resistance among the Cree. He was still guilty of organizing a rebellion, which is treason. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in the Manitoba Penitentiary. He served about half of the prison term, then was released to die a short time later, in 1888. Legacy. Frog Lake became part of the province of Alberta in 1905. The site of the massacre was designated the Frog Lake National Historic Site in 1923. Parks Canada says that the site designated by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada is extensive, but the National Park Service owns only a small portion, mainly a graveyard, where a stone cairn and federal plaque were erected in 1924. The plaque reads, Northwest Rebellion, Frog Lake Massacre. Here on 2nd April 1885, rebel Indians under Big Bear massacred Reverend Father Leon Adelaide Farfard, OMI, Reverend Father Felix Marchand, OMI, Indian Agent Thomas Quinn, Farm Instructor John Delaney, John Alexander Gowanlock, William Campbell Gilchrist, George Dill, Charles Gouen, John Williscroft. They took prisoners Mrs. Teresa Delaney, Mrs. Teresa Gowanlock. In 2008, Christine Tello, who was then the Provincial Minister for Tourism, Parks, Culture and Sport, and a false narrative historical revisionist, said the 125th commemoration in 2010 of the 1885 Northwest Resistance Rebellion is an excellent opportunity to tell the story of the Prairie Métis and First Nations peoples' struggle with government forces, which is a ridiculous way of describing murders and how it has shaped Canada today, which is an extreme exaggeration. Back to the rebellion, or more accurately, rebellions. In the days following April 2nd, Wandering Spirit's followers moved on to Fort Pitt. The Battle of Fort Pitt. The Battle of Fort Pitt was an engagement during the Northwest Rebellion in which Cree forces under the leadership of Big Bear, captured Fort Pitt from a detachment of Northwest Mounted Police on April 15, 1885. Following Frog Lake, unrest spread in parts of central and northern present-day Alberta and Saskatchewan, including raids on several isolated posts and settlements such as Lac La Biche, Saddle Lake, and Green Lake. Green Lake is also called Frank Lake. Historians emphasize that these actions were not centrally coordinated and varied in scope and motivation among different Cree and Metis participants. On April 15, 1885, 200 Cree fighters arrived at Fort Pitt. They intercepted a Northwest Mounted Police scouting party, killing one constable, wounding another, and capturing a third. Garrison Commander Francis Dickens, who was the son of novelist Charles Dickens, concluded that his force was outnumbered and ended negotiations. Big Bear released the captured police officers, but detained the civilian inhabitants and destroyed the fort. Dickens and the remaining Northwest Mounted Police personnel subsequently withdrew and reached Battleford after a 6-day march. His decision not to defend the post was later criticized in contemporary and historical accounts, although historians note the limited defensive capacity of the detachment. Following the surrender of Fort Pitt, the civilian inhabitants were taken as captives by the band of Big Bear. As it withdrew from the fort, the captives were not held at fixed location, but moved around with the band during its withdrawal through present-day Saskatchewan. During the following weeks, the group attempted to evade pursuing Canadian forces. Some captives were released or escaped individually during this period, while others remained with the band. Historical accounts generally indicate that the captives were not systematically harmed, although conditions varied during their captivity. The remaining captives were released in late May and early June 1885. A militia patrol at Fort Pitt on May 25th encountered a native man named Mamanook, a resident of Saddle Lake who was well known in Edmonton, wearing Cowan's tunic and carrying his rifle. The patrol killed him when he did not stop at their command. Cree insurgents looted Hudson's Bay posts at Lac La Biche and Green Lake on April 26th. The HBC post at Lac La Biche was pillaged. Fort Victoria was attacked, but the attack was thwarted. Fort Victoria, near present-day Smoky Lake, Alberta, is located on the north bank of the North Saskatchewan River, 100 kilometers downstream from Edmonton. Today, it is a historical museum known as Victoria Settlement. The advertisement reads, Victoria Settlement Natural Area. The small natural area is named for the Victoria Settlement Historic Site, which is about 4 kilometers upstream from it. It is located about 10 kilometers southwest of the town of Smoky Lake. Looking southward across the North Saskatchewan River, the island portion of the NA is visible midstream. Victoria Settlement NA, 2024, August 30th. P. Potter. The related article says that the site of the fort became a hub for the early settlement of east central Alberta. It came to be called the Victoria Settlement and later Pakan, after the Cree chief Pakanuk. Chief Pakan's name was sometimes given as Pekan or Sinum. The nearby rural residences make up Pakan, Alberta. Métis Crossing Cultural Heritage Gathering Center is nearby. The Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Victoria in 1864 on the North Saskatchewan River as a trading post with the local Cree First Nations. The site had previously been used starting in 1862 as a Methodist missionary site on the location of an Aboriginal meeting place. The original Methodist church is gone. In its place is the present Methodist church, built in 1906. The Methodist Church was a major Methodist denomination in Canada from its founding in 1884 until it merged with two other denominations to form the United Church of Canada in 1925. The Methodist Church was itself formed from the merger of four smaller Methodist denominations with ties to British and U.S. Methodist denominations. The area was named Victoria Settlement after Queen Victoria. It was built on the location of an Aboriginal meeting place. The fort was reported to have been closed in 1883, but was reopened in 1887. This is obviously not true, as there was obviously some sort of garrison there on April 26, 1885, that was capable of repelling the Cree attack there at that time. The Canadian militia was commanded by Major General Frederick Middleton, who had previous experience imposing imperial rule over the Maori and Indian mutineers. Middleton assembled a force that detrained from CPR trains at Qu'Appelle and then moved north toward Batoche. His column left from Qu'Appelle on April 6th and arrived at Batoche a month later. They fought the Battle of Fish Creek along the way. The Battle of Fish Creek. Here is an image of the Battle of Fish Creek, which was a major Métis victory, persuading Major General Middleton to temporarily halt his advance. The Battle of Fish Creek, also known as the Battle of Turon's Coulee, was fought on April 24, 1885, at Fish Creek, Saskatchewan. It was a major Métis victory over the Canadian forces attempting to quell Louis Riel's Northwest Rebellion. Although the reversal was not decisive enough to alter the ultimate outcome of the conflict, it was convincing enough to persuade Major General Frederick Middleton to temporarily halt his advance on Batoche, where the Métis would later make their final stand. Battle. Middleton, having led his field force out from Qu'Appelle on April 10th, was advancing upstream from Clark's Crossing along the South Saskatchewan River when scouts discovered an apparent ambush by Gabriel Dumont's Métis and Dakota force at Fish Creek, about 17 kilometers south of Batoche. Fish Creek was Métis land. Upon learning that Middleton was marching towards Batoche, Dumont suggested to Riel the use of guerrilla warfare by blowing up train tracks to slow their progress. Riel countered that guerrilla tactics were too much like Indian warfare. Dumont also proposed to attack them by surprise at night. But after he learned that Middleton's scouts were already on the lookout, he had to scrap that idea. On April 23rd, as the militia began advancing from Clark's Crossing, 90 kilometers south of Batoche, Dumont took 200 men and rode out from Batoche towards Turon's Coulee. A coulee is a large, steep-walled, trench-like trough, which also may include spillways and flood channels cut into the basalt plateau. It is also defined as a small stream, a dry stream bed, usually small or shallow ravine or gully. Louis Riel accompanied them when a false report arrived that the Northwest Mounted Police were advancing on Batoche. Riel returned there with 50 men. Dumont stationed most of his men in the coulee, where they set to work digging rifle pits. Meanwhile, Middleton had arrived at a point about 10 kilometers south of Fish Creek and set up camp. Dumont took a party of 20 horsemen forward of the coulee. Their task was to seal the exit when the ambush was sprung, like a buffalo pound. However, an inexperienced Metis soldier had forgotten Dumont's specific demand to stay away from the road, as it could give the location of the Metis away. The next day, the militia were about to attempt to cross the coulee. A scout spotted the tracks of the inexperienced Metis soldier and began to follow them. The scout was coming close to Dumont and his men, and Dumont stealthily attempted to catch him. Before Dumont could catch the scout, the Métis and Canadian militia had come into contact with each other, and it was then that the concealed Métis in the rifle pits attempted to ambush the militia. Dumont, under pressure, shot the militia scout and returned to his men in the Poplar Bluff rifle pits to fight the rest of the Canadian militia. The Métis pounded Middleton's men with one devastating fusillade before withdrawing into cover and restricting themselves to sniper fire in order to conserve ammunition. Their position was strategically selected and enabled a simple and effective strategy of defense. Since the Métis were positioned in the coulee, they were restricted to shooting up towards the Canadian militia, and many of the wounds were mainly in the upper body and head area. With half of his force on the opposite side of the river, Middleton was unable to bring his full numbers to bear. One of his artillery batteries opened fire on the Métis to little effect, although well-fired cannonades did succeed in driving away Dumont's Cree allies before their weight could be added to the battle. Many of Dumont's men were fleeing the battle. Dumont stopped as many men as he could from leaving and convinced them to keep fighting. Dumont's numbers were decreasing vastly, as he had 47 men of the 130 men that he began fighting with. Dumont was very outnumbered, but was able to keep the Métis casualties to a minimum. Strung out along the coulee's edge, silhouetted against the sky, the militia fired a vast amount of ammunition at the rebels, succeeding mostly in showering tree branches across the ravine. But when the artillerymen pushed their guns to the coulee's edge To try to fire down at the concealed Metis, they suffered heavy casualties. The only targets the militia could clearly see were the Metis' tethered horses. They killed about 55 of them. General Middleton attempted to place himself in full view of the resistance, the rebels. However, a bullet tore through his fur hat, and his two aides-de-camp were both wounded by his side. The frustrated Canadians, their casualties mounting, undertook several fruitless rushes into the ravine. A few infantry regulars under Middleton's command made one charge. Another, larger one, was carried out by the 90th Winnipeg Battalion of Rifles. This second advance was parried by the Métis' use of improvised barricades within the coulee. These uncoordinated advances accomplished nothing but more Canadian casualties. Middleton, in a statement later on, said, "Métis plans were well arranged beforehand, and had my scouts not been well to the front, we should have been attacked in the ravine and probably wiped out." With night coming on, Middleton, distressed by the casualties he was taking, opted for a retreat. At the battle's end, both sides had withdrawn from the battlefield, but the Métis had inflicted greater casualties and had delayed Middleton's march on the Métis headquarters at Batoche. Middleton's Zareba fortified camp at Batoche. The same kind of camp would have been made near Fish Creek. Weeks later, after news reached him of the Cree victory over Colonel William Dillon Otter, to whom had been issued a Gatling gun at Cut Knife, Middleton arrived at Batoche. Meanwhile, a force commanded by William Otter detrained at Swift Current and proceeded north to restore order at Battleford, fighting the Battle of Cut Knife on the way. Here is an image of the Halifax Provisional Battalion fording a stream near Swift Current, District of Assiniboine, in 1885. As Lieutenant Colonel at the time, Otter was eventually to command the Royal Canadian Regiment, and a battalion of the regiment was garrisoned in Halifax around that time. This shows where the Nova Scotian contingent was deployed during the rebellion. They were with Otter and Major General Strange. The Battle of Cut Knife was fought on May 2nd, 1885. It occurred during the Northwest Rebellion, when a flying column of Northwest Mounted Police, Canadian militia, and Canadian regulars attacked a Cree and Assiniboine TP settlement near Battleford at the Northwest Territories District of Saskatchewan. First Nations warriors forced the Canadian forces to retreat, with losses on both sides.
Seeking help at Battleford. In late March 1885, Pitikwanahapiri, Chief Mountmaker, many of his followers, and some members of Lucky Man's band walked 65 kilometers to Battleford. There they intended to declare their loyalty to the Crown and to seek additional food. Hearing of a large group of First Nations people approaching Battleford, townspeople misunderstood and were afraid. In reality, they had good reason to. These fellows were murdering and attacking people along the way. By 29th March, over 500 Euro-Canadians had crammed themselves into the quickly built, weak walls of the Battleford police post. On 30th March, Poundmaker's group arrived. Poundmaker asked to meet with Indian agent John Ray, the Queen's official representative. Poundmaker knew that as tensions rose during the Northwest Resistance, or Rebellion, he needed to openly declare his loyalty to the Crown. but Indian Agent Ray refused to meet with him. Tired from their long journey, the Nihayu were totally confused by Ray's multiple refusals to meet. That night, according to a white eyewitness and Crown official John Craig, some Nihayu women and a few men took some food from the empty town of Battleford. This is quite a misrepresentation of what actually happened. There was looting. The Nihayu left that night. According to Craig, it was white men who later looted Battleford. This is blatantly not true because it's their homes. Craig told the story to another Crown official, Robert Jefferson, who wrote about it in his memoir. There was no violent siege of Battleford. That depends on if you had lost your home to the fires and looting. Instead, there was a scared group of local residents relying on stereotypes. No, their houses were burned. An Indian agent who refused to accept Poundmaker's pleas for a meeting to declare his loyalty, actually he was just trying to not be murdered, and a group of hungry indigenous people in an empty town who were looting and burning it. The Battle of Cut Knife Hill. Nothing in late March 1885 helped calm the troubles around Battleford. If anything, it all just made Canadian officials think that Nihayu Cree were fighting the Crown, despite Pitaquanapiwian's Chief Poundmaker's attempts to declare his loyalty. After leaving Battleford, Pitaquana, its Poundmaker, man camped near Cut Knife. As word spread in April that Canadian forces were gathering in Battleford, First Nations grew fearful, and the Nihayu decided to defensively establish a soldiers' lodge. Once the Nihayu built a soldiers' lodge, leadership is transferred from the peace chief, which was Poundmaker, to the warrior society, which included Yellow Mud Blanket and Fine Day. On 2nd May 1885, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Otter, here he is in 1900, well over 300 Northwest Mounted Police, regular Army troops, militia, and volunteers with 2 weeks' worth of ammunition attacked here at Cut Knife People. The Canadians had 2 7-pound guns and a Gatling gun. Lieutenant Colonel Otter had deliberately violated his orders from Major General Frederick Middleton, the top Canadian commander during the Northwest Resistance, to remain in Battleford. Instead, Otter chose to seek a battle. This painting is titled Action at Cut Knife Creek by Robinson Wadmore in 1885. We're here at Cut Knife at the Poundmaker Museum and Gallery, winner of the 2018 ITAC Awards. In the summer months, there is also winter storytelling in Plains Indian Sign Language, and here is the name of the curator, and today it's not open. Poundmaker Cree Nation. The battle at Poundmaker was the only engagement in 1885 Northwest Resistance in which First Nations forces were involved, although involuntary. They were attacked without provocation. The diplomatic efforts of Chiefs Poundmaker and Big Bear played a significant role in preventing a more extensive conflict and are largely credited with enabling the continued peaceful settlement of the Canadian prairies. Poundmaker Cree Nation refers to this heritage site as Kitaki-Miakunka, pronounced it Kitaki-Megunga, meaning a tragic event that came close to happening. Again, here we are at Poundmaker Cree Nation, which is the battlefield of Cut Knife. Poundmaker, 1842 to 1886. Outstanding Cree chief and spokesman. He sought better treaty terms for the bands of this area. During the 1885 rebellion, he repulsed Lieutenant Colonel Otter's attack on his reserve at Cut Knife, but exercised restraint upon his followers. Imprisoned as a rebel, he died in Alberta after his early release. This is it. This is the Cut Knife battlefield. 1842 to 4th July 1886. Pitikwiha Napiwaya was one of the greatest Lihayao leaders. At Treaty 6 negotiations in 1876, Peter Napiwaya was skeptical of the treaty and worked to include a promise from the Crown of food during famines. In 1878, after 2 years of living on the Red Pheasant Reserve, Peter Napiwaya led some band members off the reserve and back to hunting buffalo. In doing so, he firmly established himself as chief. Peter Napiwayan's people had a hard time finding food. The buffalo were disappearing. In 1879, Peter Napiwayan moved to a reserve here at Cut Knife Creek. By 1881, when the Governor General visited Battleford, Peter Napiwayan's people were still struggling to have enough to eat. Peter Napiwayan told him his people wanted to live peacefully on reserve, but they needed help making enormous change from hunting buffalo to farming. 4 years later, during the Northwest Resistance of 1885, Peter Napiwayan's situation was worse than ever. His people were starving. Peter Napiwayan traveled to Battleford again to ask for help. But unlike 1881, this time Canadian officials flatly refused to meet with him. Despite this, Peter Napiwayan still called for peace with the Crown. In May 1885, after the Battle of Cut Knife Hill and the Northwest Resistance, Peter Napiwayan surrendered to Major General Middleton. At Peter Napiwayan's trial, Peter Ballandine and William McKay testified they were told Peter Napiwayan was coming to Battleford with peaceful intentions. This did not matter. Peter Napiwayan was found guilty and sent to prison. After 1 year and in poor health, he was released and traveled home to his adoptive father, Chief Crowfoot, on the Siksika Nation in today's Alberta. 4 months later, Peter Napiwayan died there on 4th July, 1886. Peter Napiwayan was reinterred here at Cut Knife Hill in 1967. In 2019, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau posthumously exonerated Peter Napiwayan of any wrongdoing. Peter Napiwayan is remembered today for his commitment to peace and desire to build a prosperous future for his people. There's a Peter Napiwayan statement after the guilty verdict, 18th August 1885. Nothing of it, the charges of treason and felony, are true. I did everything to stop the bloodshed. And more, the government mentions how much land he will give us. This is our land. It isn't a piece of pemmican, a food of buffalo berries, to be cut off and given in little pieces back to us. It is ours and what we want. The Battle of Cut Knife Hill. On the morning of May 2nd, 1885, Otter attacked. The Canadians had to ford Cut Knife Creek down there, so along here, and cross through a marsh, a swampy area down in the foreground. With 40 teams of horses, wagons, and large guns, it was impossible to keep the element of surprise. This allowed the indigenous people gathered here to organize a defense. Otter and his troops were unable to advance much past the ravines to the left and right, here and here. Lihao, Cree, Nakota, and Metis slowly surrounded the Canadian attackers. After 6 hours, Otter retreated back through the marsh and creek. The battle had cost the lives of 8 Canadians and 5 First Nations people. Otter limped back to Battleford, defeated. Here we see the Canadians' troops trying to get across. And here we have the Métis surrounding them. Here they're making an advance. Here they're not doing so well. And here are far more natives and Métis. The Battle of Cut Knife, fought on May 2nd, 1885, during the Northwest Rebellion, occurred when a flying column of Northwest Mounted Police, Canadian militia, and Canadian regulars attacked a Cree and Assiniboine teepee settlement near Battleford in the Northwest Territories District of Saskatchewan, First Nations fighters forced the Canadian forces to retreat, with losses on both sides. Background. In the spring of 1885, Louis Riel, supported by many Metis living in the District of Saskatchewan, declared a provisional government, taking control of the area around Batoche. Riel was in contact with Cree and Assiniboine bands and other First Nations groups in Saskatchewan and Alberta. The Canadian government was concerned that the resistance would spread to First Nations across the Northwest Territories. The Government of Canada quickly made preparations to send troops to crush the resistance. This group of troops would also include soldiers from as far away as Halifax, St. John, Montreal, and even St. John's, Newfoundland. The Government of Canada quickly made preparations to send troops to crush the resistance. As I said, bands of Cree, assembled under the leadership of Poundmaker, went to Battleford. The purpose of this visit was to lobby the Indian agent there, Mr. Ray, for better supplies. Many members of the band were starving, and to discuss the political situation. The people of Battleford and some of the settlers in the surrounding area, hearing reports of large numbers of Cree and Assiniboine leaving reserves and making their way to Battleford, feared for their safety. On the night of March 30th, 1885, the townspeople abandoned the town and gathered for safety at Northwest Mounted Police Fort Battleford. When Poundmaker and his party reached the town, Ray refused to come out of the fort to meet with them. He kept them waiting for 2 days. Poundmaker's people, meanwhile, suffered from hunger, having been refused supplies by Ray. The abandoned homes and businesses were looted about this time. The identity of the looters is disputed. Some reports claim Poundmaker's people were responsible, but one observer alleged that most of the looting had already been done by whites. Oral history accounts claim that the looting was done by Nakota people, and the Poundmaker did his best to stop it. Either way, Poundmaker's people left the next day. About having been looted by whites doesn't make much sense because it was their homes. They're just leaving with what they can take of their own things. Meanwhile, bands of Assiniboine living south of Battleford heard about the Metis Rebellion. A few of them killed a local farmer who had treated them harshly and shot their Indian agent for beating a teenage girl. They then went north to Battleford to meet up with Poundmaker. A number of homes and businesses in Battleford were then looted and burned. There is some controversy as to who was responsible and to the extent of the destruction. The Canadian government sent Major General Frederick Middleton to Saskatchewan to organize the suppression of the Metis Rebellion. The small police force at Fort Battleford, suddenly responsible for the safety of nearly 500 civilians and under incipient attack by native insurgents who were freely moving around outside the fort, called on him for reinforcements and hastily set about forming a home guard to garrison the post. Middleton detached a column under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel William Otter to relieve Battleford. Otter's column consisted of about 763 men of the 2nd Battalion, Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. They would have been the guys in the green uniforms. B Battery, Regiment of Canadian Artillery, C Company of the Infantry School Corps, those would be the guys in the red uniforms. A small party of Northwest Mounted Police under the command of Percy Neal and assorted Teamsters. The column traveled by rail the Swift Current, then began to march to Battleford on April 13th. Arriving on April 24th, they found hundreds of civilians, white and Métis, crammed into Fort Battleford. Poundmaker's followers were absent from the immediate scene, but it was thought that Poundmaker and many insurgents were camped on his reserve 45 kilometers northwest of Battleford. Overjoyed at Otter's revival, the townspeople and settlers wanted revenge on the Indians for the losses in lives and material that they had suffered. Many of Otter's troops, inexperienced militiamen, were angry that they had missed out on a fight. Despite orders from General Middleton to stay in Battleford, Otter wired the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories, who was also the Indian Commissioner, Edgar Dewdney, for permission to punish Poundmaker. Permission was granted, leaving garrison in Battleford. Otter led a flying column of 392 men to attack the Cree and Assiniboine at Cut Knife Hill, here. His force was made up of 75 Northwest Mounted Police, cavalry, several small units of Canadian Army regulars, and various volunteers and militia. He carried with him 2 7-pounder field rifles and a Gatling gun. He set out on the afternoon of May 1st. His plan was to march until dusk, rest until the moon rose, then continue on to attack the Cree and Assiniboine early in the morning, while they were asleep. Meanwhile, the Cree were encamped on their reserve west of Battleford, on Cut Knife Creek. They had been joined by various other bands, including Assiniboine, and knowing there were thousands of Canadian soldiers in the area to fight the Metis rebellion, they organized to protect themselves. As was the Cree custom, the war chief Fine Day replaced Poundmaker, the political chief, as leader until the fighting was over. He ordered the entire encampment to move across Cut Knife Creek to the west side on this position. Behind the camp was Cut Knife Hill, and on both sides of it were ravines filled with bushes and trees. You can see them. Although the encampment contained 9 bands of Cree and 3 bands of Assiniboine, numbering about 1,500 men, women, and children. The battle. Just after dawn on May 2nd, Otter's column arrived. Otter had experienced that the camp would be in the prairie on the east side of Cut Knife Creek. He had not anticipated that he would have to ford the creek. After his leading soldiers crossed the creek, they had to wade through a marsh before they reached the encampment. An old Cree man named Jacob, with long hair, woke up when he heard the sound of the soldiers crossing the creek, and he began to alert the fighters in the camp. Colonel Otter set up 2 cannons and a Gatling gun. They started firing on the sleeping camp. In the first few minutes, there was total confusion. The gunfire put holes in lodges and destroyed the camp. Women and children ran for the safety of the ravines. A group of Assiniboine warriors charged Otter's men to stop them from killing the women and children. The other warriors moved into the ravines, and Fine Day went to the top of Cut Knife Hill to direct the Cree counterattack. He was here, and the native troops were here, and Otter's troops were coming across in the foreground. The defenders fought in small groups. One group would run forward, attack the soldiers, then rush back into a ravine before the soldiers could shoot back at them. As soon as the soldiers tried to attack the natives on one side, fighters on the other side would rush out of the other ravine and attack them from behind. Meanwhile, other fighters guarded the women and children by taking on the soldiers at the front tip of the column. Otter could not direct the attack because he had little idea where the camp's defenders were, nor of their numbers. Robert Jefferson, an eyewitness, reported that not more than 50 natives altogether had taken part in the battle. This was understandable, since few were armed. Douglas Light's research indicates that about 243 Cree and Assiniboine men were present, and notes that a number of young boys also took part in the fight. Otter formed the soldiers into a wedge, as you can see, a wedge. 2 lines of soldiers and police faced the 2 ravines. Volunteers and militia guarded the rear, facing the marsh. Here are the volunteers, and here's the encampment. As the battle continued, Fine Day employed a flanking maneuver, whereby his fighters began to move along the 2 ravines, getting closer to the soldiers. The fighters shot from behind trees and bushes, so that Otter's men seldom saw anyone to shoot at. Eventually, the camp's defenders had almost encircled Otter's soldiers, and they were bogged down. with ravines on each side and the way out made difficult by the marsh. After 6 hours of fighting, Otter decided to order a withdrawal. As the soldiers crossed the marsh, some of Poundmaker's fighters mounted the horses to go in pursuit. Poundmaker asked them to let Otter's men leave. They respected Poundmaker and allowed Otter to retreat to Battleford without attack. Some historians believe only Poundmaker's actions prevented an outright slaughter of Otter's troops. Aftermath. Poundmaker and his people did not stay in the area but began to move away before the soldiers could recover and resume the attack. When Poundmaker heard of the Métis defeat at Batoche, he traveled to Battleford to give himself up. Conclusion. The Battle of Cut Knife was the natives' most successful battle during the Northwest Rebellion. They had the advantage of being on their own territory, but also several disadvantages. They were outnumbered, attacked by surprise, and short on ammunition. 14 of Otter's soldiers were wounded and 8 killed, including one abandoned to be mutilated by native women. 3 natives were wounded and 5 killed, including Inez Pierce, who had come north from the United States some years earlier. The battle instilled in some of Otter's men a respect for their enemy. Otter had expected Poundmaker's people to be caught off guard and demoralized and to surrender quickly, but that had not happened. However, despite suffering their greatest reverse during the campaign, sheer weight of numbers and better supplies favored the Northwest Field Force. In just a few weeks, the starving Cree went to Battleford to make peace with Major General Middleton. Fine Day, the Cree war chief who had directed the battle, escaped to the United States. Poundmaker was arrested and jailed for 7 months. Lieutenant Colonel William Otter survived the battle and remained a prominent figure in the military, commanding the Royal Canadian Regiment in the Boer War and acting as director of internment camps in World War I. Many people have compared this battle to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. There are some major similarities. In both cases, an army officer disobeyed orders. Both tried to catch a native camp by surprise. Both Custer and Otter badly misjudged the terrain and had to slow down their attacks. And both ended up being surrounded by warriors and had no idea where to charge. Otter, at least, knew when to retreat and was allowed to do so. When Custer kept fighting and suffered hundreds of casualties. Of course, the battles were very different in their outcome. Whereas Custer himself was killed, along with a third of his soldiers, Otter and most of his soldiers survived the battle and emerged with a new respect for native warriors. Legacy. Cut Knife Battlefield, named after Chief Cut Knife of the Sarcee in a historic battle with the Cree, on May 2nd, 1885, Lieutenant Colonel W.D. Otter led 325 troops composed of Northwest Mounted Police, B Battery, C Company, Foot Guards, Queen's Own and Battleford Rifles against the Cree and Assiniboine under Poundmaker and Fine Day. After an engagement of 6 hours, the troops retreated to Battleford. This is from National Historic Sites and Monuments Board. The site of the battle was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1923. There's a bronze statue at Cartier Square Drill Hall in Ottawa, Ontario. Is dedicated to William B. Osgood and John Rogers, members of the local Guards Company of sharpshooters who were killed during the Battle of Cut Knife Hill. Here lies Chief Poundmaker, 1842 to 1886. Chief Poundmaker, buried at Blackfoot Crossing, Alberta, July 4, 1886. Remains of Chief Poundmaker brought here and interred on April 18, 1967.
At Cut Knife is the world's largest tomahawk, which is shown here, with its sign beside it. The Poundmaker Historical Center and the Big Bear Monument is also in the area, and there is also a cairn erected at the historic sites by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada upon Cut Knife Hill, overlooking the Poundmaker battle site and Battle River Valley, which we have already visited. Other forces were formed in the west. The Alberta Field Force, led by Thomas Bland Strange, assembled at Calgary, moved north on the Calgary and Edmonton Trail to secure Edmonton from attack. Then went down the North Saskatchewan River to secure Victoria Settlement and recapture Fort Pitt. Then moved overland in pursuit of Big Bear's band. Early advances and the crippling of the North Coast. Conscious of the numerous reverses that had been suffered by government forces in previous clashes with the rebels, Middleton approached Batoche with caution, reaching Gabriel's Crossing on May 7th and advancing within 13 kilometers of the town the following day. Gabriel Bridge between Wacow and Rosthern is a steel truss bridge named after Gabriel Dumont. Gabriel Bridge replaced the Gabriel Ferry crossing in 1969. Gabriel Dumont operated a ferry on the South Saskatchewan River in the same area as the bridge from the early 1870s to 1883. The plaque at the crossing reads, Gabriel's Crossing. Gabriel Dumont operated a ferry on the South Saskatchewan River near this site from the early 1870s to 1883. According to his 1878 license, the ferry was a scow measuring 7.6 by 1.23 feet by 4.2 feet, 12 feet. Ferry service continued near Gabriel's Crossing until the completion of Gabriel's Bridge on Highway 312 in 1969. Middleton's plan rested on an encirclement strategy, as his main contingent advanced and came in contact with Métis defensive lines. The steamboat Northcote, carrying some of Middleton's troops, would steam past the distracted defenders and unload 50 troops at the rear of the town, effectively closing the pincer. However, due to the difficulty of the terrain and Middleton's penchant for prudence, his ground troops lagged behind schedule. When the Northcote appeared adjacent to the town on May 9th, it was spotted by Métis rebels who had not yet come under fire from the advancing ground troops. The rebels' small arms fire did little damage because of the improvised armor that protected the large boat. They lowered Batoche's ferry cable, and the Northcote steamed unsuspectingly into it, slicing off its masts and smokestacks. Here is a picture of the damaged steamboat Northcote after the battle. Crippled, the ship drifted harmlessly down the South Saskatchewan River and out of the battle.
Here is a map of the Battle of Batoche. Here's the South Saskatchewan River. Here's the old ferry dock. East Village Foundations. East Village Family Garden, Lookout Point. As you come down here, where Middleton's troops were moving, here are where the lines were of Métis, where these rifle pits were waiting for the Canadians from Ontario and Eastern Canada. Here is the church and the rectory, where major parts of the battle were. Here's the replica rifle pit we'll be seeing that in a minute.
Here's Lookout Point, the cemetery, the visitor center. This is the main battle area. Rifle pits on either side. And now we'll go on. Over here in the distance is where many of the Métis rifle pits were. And in here as well. Battle. Mission Ridge, May 9th. Not knowing what happened to the Northcote, Middleton approached the church at Mission Ridge on the morning of May 9th in order to bring his plan into effect. Some Métis in 2 houses south of the church began firing at Bolton's scouts, who were irregular Canadian cavalry. Bolton's scouts became the Manitoba Horse and was amalgamated into the Fort Garry Horse. Then artillery was brought up to shell the houses, one of which caught fire. The Métis sharpshooters fled towards the settlement. The troops advanced towards the church. As they approached the church and nearby rectory, they saw some people near those buildings whom they took to be the enemy. Second Lieutenant Arthur L. Howard, a Gatling gun expert on leave from the Connecticut National Guard, fired his Gatling gun at the rectory. Then a white flag was unfurled. Howard's firing then stopped, and several priests, nuns, women, and children came across the lines. Finding the mission occupied only by civilians, as the Métis had already fled, Middleton brought his artillery out onto the ridge and began shelling the town. Here is a house in Batoche in flames during the opening stages of the battle. The soldiers began advancing past the church and got about half a kilometer before they came under heavy fire from both sides of the trail. The militia immediately took cover. Their enemies, hidden in well-constructed rifle pits, were invisible. One trooper later wrote, "The militia was down some distance apart from each other, firing at nothing, making guess shots, and hearing the rebel bullets zip all around you, and the everlasting clack of the bullets struck the trees." Métis rifle pits. Imagine you are one of Gabriel Dumont's men, armed with shotguns, old trade muskets, and repeating rifles. It was from rifle pits like this reproduction that they fought off the attacks of the Northwest Field Force during the battle for the village. The pits, hidden among the bluffs of trees and bushes, surrounded the village in a wide semicircle and provided excellent cover for the Métis. Here is a map showing more of the rifle pit locations. Now dismounted irregular militia cavalry, Bolton's and French's scouts, were deployed on the right. The 10th Royal Grenadiers, militia infantry from Toronto, were in the center, with the 90th Winnipeg Rifles militia and Howard and his Gatling on the left to protect the artillery. The infantry of the Midland Battalion, militia from eastern Ontario, were kept in reserve near the church.
which was now being used as a Canadian field hospital. A very dangerous situation developed when a group of Metis rushed the artillery. Only Howard's directing of a heavy stream of Gatling fire at the attackers prevented a disaster. In these few minutes, the frustrated soldiers got their only clear view of the Metis fighters that they were to have until the final moments of the battle. After the attack was repulsed, the artillery was pulled back a couple of hundred meters, and the infantry and dismounted scouts followed suit. The Metis then redeployed their men to try to outflank the militia, going around the trees. That way? Over there. Yeah. To outflank, and heavy fighting ensued. Afternoon, the artillery was ordered forward again, and it began fruitlessly bombarding the invisible Metis rifle pits. The gunners were under heavy fire in a very unsafe position. The Midlanders, who had been brought forward from the church, wanted to charge their unseen enemies, but were ordered not to by Middleton. Throughout, the Gatling gun was used to good effect, providing covering fire for the withdrawal of the cannon that had come under sniper fire, and dispersing another attempt by Gabriel de Monts to capture the guns. Canadian advances saw less success, but were carefully conducted, keeping casualties to a minimum. A Métis attempt to surround the Canadian lines failed, but the brush fires meant to screen the sortie failed to spread. At the end of the day, both sides held their positions at Mission Ridge. But Middleton, shaken by the fierce resistance, ordered the Canadian soldiers to retire to Azariba, a hastily improved fortification about a mile from the Métis entrenchments, where the troops retired to sleep behind a network of improvised barricades. Azariba is a term coming from the First Boer War and the fights against the Zulu. It's an encampment with walls that are made of brush, heavy brush, rather than concrete or stones or anything like that. Walls made of brush. Azariba.
Here is a picture of those barricades. The next location is Middleton's Zariba, where his forces withdrew following the first day of the battle. The signpost pointing the way to the East Village, which is where the Zariba was. The tree lines along the way look like this. The cenotaph at the front of the military cemetery. It reads, "In spirit we reconcile on this day of July 18th, 2010, as we honor those who lost their lives in the 1885 Northwest Resistance Rebellion. We, the Métis, died for our home and our land. We, the soldiers, died for Canada. We, the First Nations, died for our Métis brothers and sisters. We are now forever free." Caron home. 4 generations of Carons lived in this home. Destroyed during the Battle of Batoche, it took 10 years to rebuild. The family was not eligible for compensation from the Rebellion Claims Commission because Jean Caron Sr. and his sons fought in the Resistance Rebellion. This home was lived in until 1970, when it was sold to Parks Canada. The restoration of the Caron home was made possible through a partnership between Parks Canada, the Gabriel Dumont Institute, the Friends of Batoche, and the Caron family. Turande family. In 1882, Josephte and Joseph Turande and their children moved to Saint Antoine de Padoue Parish, Batoche, from Manitoba. They settled near a small creek, Coulee Poisson, that emptied into the South Saskatchewan River. The area became known as Turon's Coulee. Joseph died in 1883, and 2 sons, Calixte and Elizar, were killed in the final hours of the Battle of Batoche. Madame Turande would later lose 5 more children, several grandchildren, and members of her extended family to disease. The troops plundered her property and burned her farm. Showing great courage, she demanded and received a buggy and team of horses stolen by the soldiers. The rest is a repeat of the Battle of Fish Creek. This is the view from the area of the Caron home, looking back from the Caron home towards the area where the Batoche ferry was. At the same area are the military rifle pits. The men of the Midland Battalion dug these rifle pits on the second day of the battle. Sentries were then stationed at this point to prevent the Metis and their native allies from scaling the bank to attack Middleton's troops from the flank. The information sign. This is at Middleton's Zareba. General Middleton leads his reconnaissance column out of the Zareba on the 4th day of the battle to decoy the Metis away from their rifle pits near the church and cemetery. The realities of battle. Middleton briefs his staff. Gourmet's delight, bully beef and biscuits. Middleton's Zareba information sign. Middleton's Zareba. Zareba, an Arabic term meaning hedged or palisaded enclosure. The British Army adopted the practice of building zarebas while serving in North Africa during the 19th century. These fortified camps, later used throughout the empire, were essentially corrals formed by wagons, supply bundles, and boxes, usually surrounded by some form of defensive earthwork. A zareba could be used as either a base camp for attack during the day or as a defensive position at night. At the end of the first day of fighting, Middleton decided to establish a zareba close to the village rather than returning to the campsite of the previous night, some 13 kilometers or 8 miles further to the south. Dumont's men had checked the militia advance, and Middleton was concerned about the effect a long retreat back to the original camp would have on his troops, particularly if pursued by jubilant Metis and their Indian allies. Middleton chose a location on the high ground, surrounded by as much open terrain as possible, with the river providing a natural defense to the south. As a precaution, the troops burned Jean Caron's farmhouse and buildings to the ground to prevent the Metis from using them for cover. Along the southern and western flanks, the militiamen dug rifle pits overlooking the riverbank, which we were just at, and some further west to defend the general area in the direction of the cemetery. The northwestern, northern, and northeastern sides of the zareba were the most vulnerable. The north side was particularly so because the bushes and undulating ground could provide cover during an attack. Middleton placed his artillery batteries along these flanks to provide additional support. His judgment proved sound. At no time during the 4 days of the battle was the zareba seriously threatened. Many soldiers found the first night, May 9th, uncomfortable and nerve-wracking. Night came at length, but tired as we were, it was scarcely welcome. We were cooped up and had the extreme satisfaction, a good mark for pot shooters. In the corral were more than 600 mules and horses, and 80 cattle. Men were busy throwing up hasty entrenchments, Teamsters, nervous and frightened, were yelling at equally nervous and frightened animals. Around the hospital tents, the doctors were busy dressing wounds, probing for bullets, etc. The bullets were whizzing and singing overhead, and occasionally striking inside. Pleasant prospects for the night, especially when one remembered that favorite trick among the Reds is to stampede the cattle and horses of the enemy. Hooves would be apt to deal than balls. Against frightened animals, cooped up in a small space, we had absolutely no defense. The anticipations of a mean night were largely realized, though thus far we have escaped a stampede. Few, if any, slept more than 5 hours consecutively, and the firing kept up all night. The next day, May 10th, the Teamsters and the Midland Battalion strengthened the Zariba. On May 11th, Middleton led a mounted reconnaissance force from the Zariba to test the Métis right flank. On May 12th, the Northwest Field Force captured Batoche and constructed another Zariba at the village in case of a Métis counterattack. Here is a map showing the location of the second Zariba. Here is a better look at the Zariba walls. Probing attacks, 10th May to 11th May. On 10th May, Middleton established heavy defended gun pits, so he dug in too, and conducted a devastating day-long shelling of the town. It was a set for that in that direction. We're in the rectory now, where the gun was firing and the nuns and the priests came out. Okay? Attempted advances, however, were turned back by Métis fire, and no ground was gained. The next day, Middleton gauged the strength of the defenders by dispatching a contingent of men north, which was north. That way. North. Okay. So, along the enemy's flank, while simultaneously conducting a general advance along the front. Having redirected a portion of their strength to hold the northward flank, the Métis lacked the manpower to oppose the Canadian thrust, ceding ground with little resistance. Canadian soldiers ventured as far as the Batoche cemetery before turning back. Satisfied with his enemy's weakness, Middleton retired to sleep and contended to take the town in the morning. The storming of Batoche, 12th May. On 12th May, Métis defenses were in poor shape. Of the original defenders, 3/4 had either been wounded by artillery fire or were scattered and divided into many clashes with the Canadians on the outskirts of the town. Those that still held their positions were fatigued and desperately short of ammunition. They resorted to hunting in the underbrush for bullets fired by Canadian troops and firing them back, and some fired nails and rocks, forks, and knives instead of bullets out of their rifles. Middleton's attack plan on this day was designed to mirror the success of the previous day's flanking feint, with one column drawing defenders away and north, and the second under Colonel Bowen van Straubenzee. Van Straubenzee was also, like several other senior generals of the British Army, wasn't really British, he was German. Many of the senior generals of the British Army were Irish. There weren't that many British senior officers. Anyways, von Straubenzee was a German working for the British Army. He was also involved in the opening moves, assaulting the town directly. At first, on the morning of 12th May, Middleton's plan went awry. Von Straubenzee and his men did not attack because the wind was blowing away from them, and they did not hear the sound of the North column's gunfire. Middleton, working with the North column, returned to colonels and stalked off to lunch. The previous night, some of the senior Canadian officers, exasperated by Middleton's caution, had discussed undertaking a charge. Now, Van Straubenzee was more amenable to this. He's okay for the charge as well. Afternoon, the Midlanders and Royal Grenadiers moved forward again to a point near the Batoche cemetery over there. No one knows precisely who ordered the wild mass Canadian Grenadiers charge, which now ensued. Firing at will and cheering, the Midlanders and Grenadiers, aided by the Winnipeg 90th Rifles, rushed at the Métis rifle pits. Many of the Métis fighters were still out of position, having been drawn away from the cemetery and church to the northeast by Middleton's fate that morning. Ammunition on the Métis side was very low. Nevertheless, they resisted bravely, aided by sharpshooters firing from across the Saskatchewan River at the charging militia. However, the charge was irresistible. Middleton ordered the rest of his troops to assist by covering the flank of the charging men. Howard and his Gatling were moved up. The charging militia stormed into the village of Batoche. Then, their enemies rallied. Métis and First Nations, who had been drawn away to the east by Middleton's flank in the morning, now appeared and commenced a heavy fire from the pits to brush near the village. A senior Canadian officer, Captain French, was killed as he fired from a second-story window. But the artillery and the Gatling were brought up to break this new resistance. The last defenders of the Batoche surrendered. Straubenzee's soldiers charged into Batoche, driving the remaining Métis clear of the town. Middleton's plan was an impetuous charge by Canadian militia that seen the last defenders overrun, and resistance at Batoche ended. The Métis defeat at Batoche virtually ended the Northwest resistance. Louis Riel was captured and was hanged for treason in Regina on 16/11. Gabriel Dumont fled to the United States, returning to Batoche in 1893. When he died, his body was buried there. Poundmaker and Big Bear both were sentenced to big prison terms. Amnesty was granted for rank and file fighters. However, several murders that had taken place outside the fighting were punished. The largest mass hanging in Canadian history took the lives of 8 men in November 1885. Here is an image of Middleton's troops gauging the strength of the defenders on May 10th and 11th. Here is a map of the Battle of Batoche. Here is an image of the charge, the one that no one knows precisely who ordered the wild mass Canadian charge, but here is an image of it. Here is an image of the Canadian militiamen rushing the Métis rifle pits. Here is an image of the Métis counterattack at the town of Batoche. Middleton's forces proceeded north to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and some units were disbanded without delay and sent home to eastern Canada. Casualties. Middleton reported 8 deaths and 46 wounded on the Canadian side, and 51 deaths and 173 wounded on the Métis side. Later, Father Vegreville's report claimed that the Métis losses were not as high as the mission first reported to Middleton. Vegreville's report claimed that there were 16 Métis killed and between 20 and 30 wounded during the battle, which is still slightly higher than one commonly accepted by false narrative revisionist historians in the past few years, which is 12 dead and 20 wounded. 9 of the Métis killed in the battle were buried separately in the cemetery at Batoche. 8 more are in a common grave. This already proves the revisionists wrong. The Battle of Batoche. Following the battle, it is claimed that several Canadian soldiers from Millbrook, Ontario, seized the bell from the Batoche church and took it back to Ontario as a prize. The fate of the bell became an issue of long-standing controversy involving several Métis organizations and the provincial governments of Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. The Millbrook Bell is now identified as the identical bell of Frog Lake. Legacy. Batoche, where the Métis Provincial Rebel Government had been formed, has been declared a National Historic Site. Batoche marks the site of Gabriel Dumont's gravesite, Albert Caron's house, Batoche School, Batoche Cemetery, Le Tendre Store, Gabriel's River Crossing, Garpides Crossing, Batoche Crossing, Saint Antoine de Padoue Church, Métis Rifle Pits, and Canadian Militia's Battle Camp. The Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada cites Batoche. In 1872, Xavier Le Tendre de Batoche founded a village at this site where Métis freighters crossed the South Saskatchewan River. About 50 families had claimed the river lots in the area by 1884. Widespread anxiety regarding land claims and a changing economy provoked a resistance against the Canadian government. Here, 300 Métis and First Nations, led by Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, fought a force of 800 men commanded by Major General Middleton between May 9th and 12th, 1885. The resistance, rebels, failed, but the battle did not mean the end of the community of Batoche. Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, Government of Canada. This statement was made in 2008 and once again misleadingly claims the rebellion as a resistance. It downplays and ignores the efforts of the Canadian militia. Ending the Cree uprising. The capture of Batoche did not end the separate conflict with the Cree insurgents. Otter's column recovered from its defeat at Cut Knife Hill, which is today called Poundmaker Hill. They pressed on to secure Battleford from additional Cree raids. Poundmaker and several of the chiefs loyal to him marched into Battleford and surrendered on May 26. On May 14th, Major General Thomas Bland Strange led the Alberta Field Force, a mixed force of militia, and an NWMP detachment from Calgary eastwards down the North Saskatchewan River toward the scene of unrest. Part of his force was on barges, the rest were on foot or horseback moving along the shore. Conditions were unpleasant as it was cold and snowy. By May 25th, the force was at Fort Pitt and Frog Lake. On May 28th, the force came into contact with Big Bear's band, who had been holding a thirst dance on a hill north of Fort Pitt. The soldiers advanced to attack, but fighters in the band won a battle at Frenchman's Butte, 43 kilometers northeast of Lloydminster, at the end of May. The Battle of Frenchman's Butte. The Battle of Frenchman's Butte was fought on May 28, 1885. It occurred when the Alberta Field Force attacked a force of Cree dug in on a hillside near Frenchman's Butte. The battlefield is located in what was then the District of Saskatchewan of the Northwest Territories, now the province of Saskatchewan. Background. Members of a band of Cree, led by War Chief Wandering Spirit, living in what is now central Alberta and Saskatchewan, joined the Northwest Rebellion in 1885 after the government forces' defeat at the Battle of Duck Lake. The starving fighters seized food and supplies from several white settlements and captured Fort Pitt, taking prisoners. Major General Thomas Bland Strange, a retired British officer living near Calgary, raised a force of cowboys and other white settlers, added to them 2 units of Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, and headed north. He was reinforced by 3 infantry units from the east, bringing his forces to about 1,000 men. His column consisted of the 63rd Battalion with 232 soldiers, Winnipeg Provisional Battalion, 92nd, of 307 soldiers, Strange's Rangers, Alberta Scouts, which were 80 men, and 67 NWMP policemen. The Halifax Provisional Battalion may have also been attached to this force. The 90th Winnipeg Rifles were serving with Middleton's forces. The 92nd Winnipeg Provisional Battalion was a separate unit. Strange's Rangers, Alberta Scouts, was disbanded immediately after the rebellion and has no direct connection to the South Alberta Light Horse Regiment of today. While he left some of his force to provide protection for isolated white settlements along the way, he secured Edmonton, then led his column east to Fort Pitt. As he approached, Cree insurgents burnt the fort as they retreated to some nearby hills. Over the next few days, Strange's scouts fought skirmishes with small groups of Cree, and in pursuit of Big Bear, marched to the area of Frenchman's Butte. On the night of May 27th, the Cree dug in at the top of a hill east of the butte and waited. The battle. Early on the morning of May 28th, the Cree fighters divided into 2 groups. Wandering Spirit, the Cree war chief, led about 200 warriors to take positions in the trenches and rifle pits on top of the hill, while Little Poplar and the other group remained to protect the camp, about 3 kilometers away. General Strange arrived opposite the Cree-occupied hill at 6 in the morning and opened fire with a small cannon. The Cree then opened fire with their guns on Strange's soldiers. Some of his soldiers started across the valley, but found it soft going due to muskeg. As well, movement forward came under fire from Cree warriors on top of a steep, open hillside, making a frontal assault suicidal. Strange pulled his forces back and deployed them along the bottom of the valley. The 2 units of NWMP formed the left flank. To the right was the 65th Battalion, Mount Royal Rifles, with the Winnipeg Light Infantry Battalion in the center, while the right flank was formed by Strange's Alberta Scouts. Here is an image of Alberta Field Force artillery firing on Cree fighters. It is from a British book. The 2 sides exchanged gunfire for 3 hours. Cree rifle fire wounded some of the soldiers in the valley, while Strange's artillery put holes in the hillside, damaging the trenches where Cree sheltered. Eventually, General Strange ordered Major Sam Steele to lead the NWMP north and outflank the Cree fighters. This maneuver was seen, and Wandering Spirit and others moved along the crests of hills parallel to Steele, and occasionally fired on them. This caused Steele to believe the Cree's lines were longer than they were. So he ordered his NWMP force to turn back. Around the same time, some Cree warriors outflanked the Alberta Mounted Rifles and almost captured the column's supply train. Afraid of being attacked from behind, General Strange ordered his forces to retreat. Strange's troops withdrew to Fort Pitt. The Cree fighters slipped away later that day, and soon more than 1,000 soldiers resumed their search for Big Bear's band. H.A. Mackay later recounted the day's events and its aftermath. On May 29th, near Frenchman's Butte, Inspector S.B. Steele made contact with an Indian scouting party. Steele's scouts called out to the party and were fired upon. Steele's troops returned fire and killed the first Indian casualty of the war. They rode down with a friend to view the remains and found his body on top of the hill where he evidently had been dragged by the scout. His body was stripped of all clothing, with the rope cut short to about 1 yard in length still around his neck, which had cut into his jaw. He was a huge, fine-looking Indian, Mahmid Book by name, belonging the scout who had captured his mount, a swift black stallion belonging to the HBC company, had galloped around the prairie with the rope attached to his saddle pommel, trailing the body in the grass in circles, the trails of which were still visible. He had thus been left exposed for days before being buried, and his body, from the intense heat, was huge in size when I saw him. I requested to have him buried. H.A. Mackay, Memories, HBC Company, Archives, and Glenbow Archives. Conclusion. The battle was a victory for Big Bear's band, although it was a hollow one. It bought them time to escape from Strange, but continued resistance was hopeless. The Metis had been defeated at the Battle of Batoche 3 weeks earlier, and Poundmaker's joint Cree Assiniboine force had surrendered. Big Bear's band fell apart during the retreat to the north after the battle. The Battle of Loon Lake demoralized them further. Frenchman's Butte is a National Historic Site of Canada, which locates the theatre of the 1885 battle between Cree and Canadian troops. The plaque on the monument at the site reads, Frenchman Butte. After pillaging Fort Pitt, several hundred Cree, led by Big Bear, entrenched themselves here late in May 1885. They were followed by Major General T.B. Strange, commanding the Alberta Field Force, about 500 men, including units of the Winnipeg Light Infantry, 65th Montreal Voltigeurs, Alberta Mounted Rifles, Steele's Scouts, and Northwest Mounted Police. After a sharp engagement on May 28th, the troops retired. Later, the Indians withdrew northward, but Big Bear returned, and on July 2nd surrendered at Fort Carleton. Big Bear's band pushed off to the north, and NWMP Major Sam Steele's mounted scouts followed the trail. Small battles took place when Strange's scouts journeyed to where Big Bear's soldiers had trenches between Frenchman's Butte and the Little Red Deer River, and again at Horse Lake, about 30 kilometers from Fort Pitt. The Battle of Loon Lake, also known as the Battle of Steel Narrows, concluded the Northwest Rebellion on June 3, 1885, and was the last battle fought on Canadian soil. It was fought in what was then the District of Saskatchewan of the Northwest Territories, at what is now known as Steel Narrows, at Mackwell Lake. Mackwell Lake is marked in two different places. The left side is Mackwell Lake Loon Lake, what the town is named after. Steel Narrows is a channel that separates Sanderson Bay from Mackwell Loon Lake. Led by Major Sam Steele, a force of Northwest Mounted Police, Alberta Mounted Rifles, and Steele's Scouts, which were a body of mounted militia raised by Steele himself, caught up with and dispersed a band of Plains Cree warriors and their white and Metis hostages. Cree scouts made a determined stand with what was left of their ammunition, but the body of the Cree column, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, released their prisoners and fled. The Cree casualties were 4 dead and dozens wounded. Demoralized, defenseless, and with no hope of relief after Poundmaker's surrender, most of Big Bear's fighters surrendered over the next few weeks. On July 2nd, Big Bear voluntarily surrendered to NWMP Sergeant Smart, stationed at an NWMP post near the destroyed Fort Carleton. Wandering Spirit, the war chief leading the Cree military campaign, surrendered to authorities at Fort Pitt. The site of the battle was designated as a National Historic Site of Canada in 1950. The Battle of Loon Lake is commemorated today by interpretive signs placed by the Government of Saskatchewan and a plaque placed by the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. The plaque reads, Steel Narrows. On June 2, 1885, Big Bear's Indians, with hostages from Fort Pitt, retiring from the Battle of Frenchman's Butte, were overtaken here by Inspector Sam Steele and a small detachment of Northwest Mounted Police. After a 3-hour exchange of fire, the Indians fled northward with their prisoners, and the police retired to seek help. 5 days later, General Middleton took up the chase, but Muskeg so impeded his forces that he reluctantly turned back. The prisoners later escaped. This was the last engagement of the Northwest Rebellion. There are several errors on this plaque. The area of the battlefield was designated a provincial park in 1986. Steele Narrows Provincial Park is an 88-hectare park that conserves the lookout point of a Cree burial ground, has interpretive plaques, and a recreation area. This ends this documentary on the Northwest Rebellion of 1885.